He did not raise his voice. He did not make a scene. He walked into the lobby of Hargrove Capital with a folder of documents under his arm, and the kind of quiet that comes not from defeat but from absolute certainty. And the man behind the marble desk looked at him the way people sometimes look at a delivery driver who has wandered into the wrong entrance. The folder was not thin. It contained 14 months of work. His name was Joel Carver. He was 41 years old. He drove a 2009 Ford F-150 with a cracked dashboard and a bumper sticker his daughter Maeve had put there when she was 6. A cartoon dog wearing a hard hat. She was 9 now. She still thought it was funny. He did too, most mornings, though some mornings were harder than others. He had been a mechanical engineer for 16 years. Before that, he had been the kind of kid who took apart the family's washing machine at age 12 and put it back together correctly, which his mother had not entirely forgiven him, for even though it ran better afterward. He knew machines the way some people know music, not as a subject to be studied but as a language that had always made sense to him intuitively in a way that other things in life sometimes did not. His wife, Catherine, had died 3 years earlier. Pancreatic cancer, 11 months from diagnosis to the end, which is how that particular illness tends to work. He did not talk about it often. He did not talk about much that was personal. He went to work, he came home, he made dinner, he helped Maeve with her reading, and on weekends he drove her to hockey practice at the rink on Dunmore Road and sat in the cold bleachers with a thermos of coffee and watched her move across the ice with a seriousness that she had not inherited from him but that he recognized anyway. He was not a man who asked for things. He was, by habit and by temperament, a man who figured things out on his own. Which was why it had taken him so long to walk through the front door of Hargrove Capital, and why when he finally did, he had made absolutely sure he had every document in order. The idea had started as a side project. He worked for a mid-sized manufacturing firm in Hamilton, Ontario called Belford Industrial. They made components, specialized brackets, couplings, load-bearing hardware for industrial equipment. Good work, honest work, the kind of company that had been around for 40 years and intended to be around for 40 more, and that ran on the expertise of people like Joel, who could look at a machine and hear, somewhere underneath the noise, what it was about to do wrong before it did it. He had been there for 9 years. He was good at his job. His supervisor, a methodical woman named Diane Ostrowski, had told him once that he was the best diagnostic engineer she had worked with in 23 years, and she was not a person who gave that kind of assessment lightly. He had thanked her and gone back to his workbench. The project started about 2 years after Catherine died. He needed something to do with his hands in the evenings, after Maeve went to sleep, and he had always been bothered by a particular inefficiency in the kind of hydraulic sealing systems used in heavy equipment, a tolerance problem, a friction variable that manufacturers had been compensating for in ways that were expensive and imprecise. He started sketching. He ran the numbers. He built a prototype in his garage using parts he had ordered online, and some he had machined himself on a small lathe he had bought secondhand from a retiring tradesman in Brantford. It took 14 months. He rebuilt the prototype 4 times. The 5th version worked exactly as he had calculated it would, and when he ran it through stress testing in his garage at 11:30 on a Tuesday night, with Maeve asleep upstairs and the neighbors' lights all out, he sat on a plastic stool in the cold and looked at the readout on his laptop and felt something he had not felt in a long time. Not pride exactly, more like relief, like something had finally said what it had been trying to say. He filed a provisional patent. He consulted a lawyer friend from university, a man named Doug Abernethy, who owed him several favors, and who confirmed that what Joel had was not only patentable but commercially significant. The efficiency gains were not marginal. In heavy equipment applications, mining, construction, large-scale agriculture, the cost savings over a maintenance cycle were substantial. Doug used words like licensing revenue and strategic partnership, and told Joel he needed to take this to someone with capital, not just a patent office, which was how the name Hargrove Capital entered his life. Hargrove Capital was not a well-known firm to ordinary people, but in the industrial investment space in southern Ontario, it was the kind of name that opened rooms. It had been built over 30 years by a man named Sterling Hargrove, who had grown up in Windsor and who had, by the time Joel Carver was putting on his jacket in his driveway in Hamilton, accumulated a portfolio that included minority stakes in 11 manufacturing operations, 2 processing plants, and a commercial real estate holding company that quietly owned more of downtown Brantford than most people realized. Sterling Hargrove was 64 years old. He was tall in the way that men of a certain generation carry themselves as if height is a credential. He wore dark suits that fit well and spoke with the measured authority of someone who had been the smartest person in most rooms for so long that he had stopped noticing the effect it had. He was not cruel in any obvious way. He was something that is harder to name. A man who had lived long enough inside his own success that other people had become, to him, largely theoretical. Joel had sent a summary document to Hargrove Capital 3 months before he walked through their door, a 2-page overview, technical but accessible, with the provisional patent number attached and a request for a preliminary meeting. He had received a form response from an assistant named Brenda Foss saying the firm would review submissions within 60 days and contact him if there was interest. He heard nothing. He sent a follow-up after 60 days. Then a second one, referencing the review agreement that had been part of their standard intake terms, which he had read carefully and kept a copy of. Still nothing. On the 91st day, he drove to Hamilton's downtown core, found parking 3 blocks away because the lot closest to Hargrove Capital's building charged $18 for the first hour, and he did not have $18 to spend on parking, and walked to the front entrance of a glass tower that reflected the gray November sky back at itself. He had the folder, he had the documents, he had the submission confirmation number from his original email and a printed copy of the intake terms. He had everything he needed. What he had not prepared for entirely was Sterling Hargrove himself. The lobby of Hargrove Capital's office on the 14th floor was the kind of space designed to make a particular point before any conversation began. The reception desk was granite. The lighting was recessed and warm. The furniture was the kind that looks simple and costs an amount that would seem offensive if stated plainly. There were no posters, no brochures, no indication that this was a place where anyone was trying to attract business, only the quiet suggestion that business came to them. Joel told the woman at the desk his name, explained that he had submitted materials for review under the firm's standard intake agreement and asked to speak with someone about the status of that review. He spoke clearly. He did not rush. She made a call. There was a brief exchange he could not fully hear. She said she would check. There was a longer pause, and then, from somewhere to the left of the reception area, a door opened and Sterling Hargrove walked out. Joel had not expected him personally. He had expected an associate, a junior partner, someone in an intermediary role. Sterling Hargrove walked with the unhurried pace of someone who had come out not to facilitate a meeting, but to observe something, the way a property owner might come to the door to look at an uninvited guest on his front porch. He looked at Joel. He looked at the folder. "You're the mechanic," Sterling Hargrove said. He did not ask it. He said it, and the way he said it contained a very specific kind of dismissal. Not rude in any actionable sense, but precise. The word mechanic in his mouth was not a neutral description of a trade. It was a category. It was a placement. It was a door closing before it had been asked to open. Joel said he was a mechanical engineer, and that he had submitted materials for review under the firm's intake agreement, and that the 60-day review period had elapsed, and that he was there to either receive a substantive response or to formally request that his materials be returned and logged as reviewed. Sterling Hargrove looked at him for a moment. Then he looked past him at the receptionist and said, "Call building security. This gentleman doesn't have an appointment." Joel did not move. He said he was not there without authorization. He was there under the terms of the intake agreement, which constituted a contractual relationship, and he wanted that acknowledged in writing before he left. Sterling Hargrove smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the kind of smile that belongs to a man who has said the last word in many conversations and knows what that smile means and what it does to people. "You're welcome to call anyone you want," he said. "Call your lawyer, call whoever you like. This is private property, and you don't have a meeting." 2 security officers arrived. They were professional, not unkind. But they were there, and the instruction was clear, and Joel Carver, who had driven 3 blocks from his truck and paid for parking and carried 14 months of work in a manila folder, found himself in the position of being escorted from the building, while Sterling Hargrove stood by his receptionist's desk and watched with the expression of a man watching something entirely predictable unfold. Joel did not argue. He did not raise his voice. At the reception counter, before he turned toward the elevator, he set down his folder, not dropped it, set it deliberately, alongside a printed copy of his submission confirmation and the intake terms document, face up, and he said to the receptionist, quietly enough that it was just for her, "Please make sure this is logged as received. Today's date. My name is on the cover page." She looked uncertain. She glanced toward the far end of the desk where Sterling Hargrove was no longer watching, already having turned back toward his office. She logged it. The drive back to Hamilton took 40 minutes in light traffic. Joel stopped at a Tim Hortons on the way out of the city and ordered a medium coffee, double-double, and sat in the parking lot for a few minutes before pulling back onto the highway. He was not shaking. He was not, as far as he could tell, particularly angry, or at least not in the way that anger makes people do things they later regret. He was something more controlled than that, and more patient, which in his experience tended to be more useful. He called Doug Abernethy from the highway and told him what had happened. Doug was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "They logged it?" "She logged it." Another pause. "All right," Doug said. "Then we have something to work with." What they had, specifically, was this. The intake agreement that Hargrove Capital provided to prospective submitters was not merely a form letter. It was a document with legal standing. It established a review obligation. It specified that materials submitted under the agreement would be reviewed in good faith within 60 days, and that the firm would provide either a substantive response or a written declination. It also contained, in language that was easy to overlook because it was written in the measured tones of standard legal boilerplate, a non-circumvention clause, meaning that the firm could not use submitted materials, or derivative knowledge gained from them, for its own commercial purposes without the submitter's consent. Joel had read this clause on the day he submitted. He had kept a copy of the intake agreement. He had also, on the advice of Doug, who was careful by habit, attached a technical summary to his original submission that was specific enough to demonstrate the core innovation, without revealing the complete implementation. Enough to show what the technology did, not enough to replicate it independently, unless someone with resources and access to the right people decided to try. It took Doug 4 days to find what he found. Hargrove Capital had, 2 weeks before Joel walked into their lobby, entered into a preliminary partnership discussion with a manufacturing components firm based in Oakville. The nature of the discussion was, on its surface, about market expansion, but embedded in the publicly filed preliminary agreement, because certain things, in certain jurisdictions, have to be filed, was a reference to a proprietary sealing improvement in hydraulic systems that the Oakville firm claimed to be developing. Joel looked at the description. He recognized every word of it, not because the language was identical to his submission. It was not. It had been rewritten, restructured, attributed elsewhere. But the underlying technical concept, the specific tolerance correction, the friction variable solution that he had worked out over 14 months in a cold garage in Hamilton, while his daughter slept upstairs, it was his. He knew it the way you know your own handwriting, the way you know the particular sound of your own front door. Doug said they needed to move carefully. He was right. They moved carefully. What followed was not a dramatic confrontation. It was not a moment that could have been filmed. It was phone calls and emails and document requests and, eventually, a formal complaint filed with the Ontario Securities Commission. Because the preliminary partnership agreement had been filed in a way that triggered disclosure obligations, and the disclosure had been incomplete in ways that were not accidental. It was also a letter to the engineering firm's intellectual property counsel, with the submission date, the intake agreement, the logged receipt from Hargrove Capital's own receptionist, and the provisional patent number attached. The letter was dry. It was precise. It was the kind of letter that does not need to raise its voice because the documents do the speaking. The response from Hargrove Capital's legal team came within 2 weeks. It was aggressive in the way that legal correspondence is sometimes aggressive when the person sending it knows the underlying position is weak, full of language about prior development and independent conception, and the distinction between general industry knowledge and proprietary innovation. Doug was not impressed. He sent a response that was shorter and more specific and attached a third document that he had spent 3 days preparing, a technical analysis drafted by an independent engineering consultant from the University of Waterloo that compared Joel's provisional patent filing, dated and time-stamped, with the Oakville firm's claimed development timeline and found, in the consultant's measured professional language, that the timeline was not credible given the documented prior art. The Ontario Securities Commission opened a formal inquiry 8 days later. Joel did not follow the inquiry in real time. He went to work, he came home, he made dinner. On the Wednesday evening after the OSC notification was filed, he and Maeve sat at the kitchen table and worked through her long division homework, which she found boring, and which he found, honestly, a little boring too, though he did not say so. She had Catherine's way of holding a pencil, and sometimes it caught him off guard, and he would look down at the paper and be very focused on the problem for a moment. He had told her some of what was happening, not the legal details, but the shape of it. Someone had taken something that wasn't theirs, and he was trying to get it back. She had nodded with the seriousness of someone who had thought about fairness already, in the way that 9-year-olds who have lost someone tend to think about things earlier than other children. "Did you prove it was yours?" she asked. "I have the paperwork," he said. She seemed to find this satisfactory. She went back to her long division. The inquiry took 4 months. It was not public in its early stages, but its conclusions eventually were, because that is how the OSC works when it finds what it found. The preliminary partnership between Hargrove Capital and the Oakville firm was suspended pending the outcome. The Oakville firm's legal representation withdrew partway through, which is itself a kind of statement. 2 of Hargrove Capital's institutional lenders, a pension fund and a regional development bank, both of which had compliance obligations that extended beyond ordinary commercial judgment, were notified of the inquiry's scope. Sterling Hargrove issued a statement through his communications team that used the words misunderstanding and standard industry practice in the same sentence, which did not age well. The OSC's final report used different language. It found that materials submitted under a formal intake agreement had been used in a manner inconsistent with the terms of that agreement, and that the preliminary partnership filing had contained representations that were misleading with respect to the origin of the core technical concept. It recommended penalties. It recommended corrective disclosures. It made specific note of the logged receipt dated to the day Joel Carver had walked into the lobby with his folder. That logged receipt was, in the end, the document that mattered most. Not the most technical, not the most complex, just the one that the receptionist had entered into the system at Joel's quiet, specific request, the one that established, with a timestamp and an intake number, that the materials had been received, and when, and by whom. Doug called Joel the morning the report went public. "You should read it," he said. "I will," Joel said. "Tonight. How's Maeve? She won the spelling bee last week." "Of course she did." Joel was at work when the call came. He was standing beside a hydraulic press that had been running rough for 3 days, listening to it, trying to isolate the sound. He found it, a bearing, worn unevenly, compensating in a way that was going to become a real problem within another week. He wrote it up, flagged it for the maintenance schedule, and went back to his bench. Diane Ostrowski stopped by his workstation sometime around 2 in the afternoon. "I heard," she said. She did not specify what she had heard. She did not need to. In a mid-sized firm in a mid-sized city, certain things travel, he nodded. "Good," she said and walked away. The penalties that came down on Hargrove Capital were not the kind that end a company immediately. Sterling Hargrove's firm had been operating for 30 years, and 30-year-old firms have layers of structure that absorb things. But they were not cosmetic either. The OSC findings triggered a review from 2 of the institutional lenders, and one of the pension funds quietly declined to renew its participation in a forthcoming capital raise. A minority stakeholder in 2 of Hargrove Capital's manufacturing investments chose that particular quarter to exercise an exit clause that had been sitting dormant for years. Sterling Hargrove did not go to prison. That is a fact worth stating plainly, because the world does not always resolve the way a story might want it to. What happened to him was slower and more erosive. The kind of consequence that does not arrive in one moment, but accumulates across months and quarters, in boardrooms where his name was now attached to a finding, in relationships where the word credibility had begun to require qualifications. He stepped back from the firm's active management 14 months after the OSC report was published. The announcement used the word transition. His communications team did their best. Joel did not read the announcement when it came out. Maeve was at hockey practice, and he was in the bleachers on Dunmore Road with his thermos, watching her move across the ice. The licensing agreement was signed in the spring, not with Hargrove Capital. That door had closed in a direction that suited Joel fine. It was with a different firm, a mid-sized industrial group based in Guelph, that had been following the OSC case and that reached out to Doug through the kind of quiet professional channel that these things sometimes move through when the people involved are serious and not interested in drama. The terms were fair. Joel had Doug review every line. He had a second lawyer look at the royalty structure. He was not in a hurry, and he was not desperate, and the people on the other side of the table understood both of those things and proceeded accordingly. The first royalty payment arrived in August. It was not a transformational amount. It was enough. It was enough to pay off the remaining balance on Catherine's medical bills that had been sitting on a repayment plan for 2 years. It was enough to put the first real deposit into the savings account he had opened for Maeve's university fund. It was enough that when he sat at the kitchen table and looked at the number, he felt something quiet and solid settle somewhere in his chest. He did not call anyone. He made dinner, pasta, because Maeve had requested it, because pasta was her preferred meal for what she called Important Tuesdays, a category she had invented at age 7 and never fully explained. He set the table. He poured himself a glass of water and her a glass of orange juice, and they ate. And she told him about a book she was reading at school, a story about a girl who builds a boat, and he listened, and outside the window, the August light stayed long and gold over the rooftops of the neighborhood, the way it does in Ontario in that particular month, generous and unhurried, as if it has nowhere else to be. He thought about Catherine briefly the way he did most evenings. He thought about the garage and the prototype, and the cold stool and the laptop screen in the dark. He thought about the lobby with the granite desk, and the man who had looked at him and said the word mechanic, the way you set something down on a low shelf. He thought about the receptionist who had logged the receipt. He hoped she was well. He had never learned her name. He had meant to send something, a card, a note, and had not found the right way to do it, without it becoming a thing about the case, which he had not wanted. Someday, maybe, there would be a way to simply say thank you to someone who had done a small, decent thing at exactly the moment it was needed, without needing to make it large. Maeve finished her pasta and asked if there was dessert. There was ice cream. There almost always was. He served it, and she ate it with the focused appreciation that she brought to most things she genuinely enjoyed. And the kitchen was warm, and outside the light was still going, still trying to hold on to the end of the day. And Joel Carver sat across from his daughter and felt, without making a production of it, that things were going to be all right. Not perfect, not without difficulty, not in the way that made for clean endings, just all right, which, he had learned, was more than enough.